In this video we are going to take another look at the iconic flyer of the Deathwatch, the Corvus Blackstar. Arguably one of the best looking models in the entire game, but can it also deliver on the tabletop these days? In the first part, we will look at its datasheet, general abilities and recent rules changes. In the second part, we will then look into how to make best use of them in our Arks of Omen Deathwatch lists. Lastly, there will be some modeling recommendations and a quick wrap up.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer and I will be guiding you through this video.
When I last covered the Corvus Blackstar in a dedicated video almost 2 years ago, I mentioned in my opening that rarely have I seen more mixed opinions about the unit. Some call it useless beyond narrative play, others insist on it being the hidden gem of the Deathwatch army. If anything, that part has not changed since then. But anyway, starting with some good news first. While the Corvus Blackstar was priced at 180 base points back in the original Deathwatch supplement, and the additional war gear could bring it up to like 200 points, GW has been consistently dropping its points over the course of several Monitorum Field Manual releases. With the latest release back in January, the Corvus Blackstar is now priced at a very affordable 150 points, and in line with what happened to most Space Marine datasheets, all its war gear is now free. This means that we are looking at a roughly 25% discount since its original 9th edition datasheet release, well below the price of a Redemptor Dreadnought, which is often being taken as a reference point for a comparison, but more on this later. On the datasheet itself, however, there were no changes aside from the previously mentioned free war gear. The Corvus Blackstar is an aircraft and has a default movement of 20 to 50 inches, more on that later. With 14 wounds, toughness 7 and a 3+ save, it's actually not that durable when properly focused down. It will also degrade, which will matter for its movement and ballistic skill. Its default loadout are 2 Blackstar rocket launchers and the twin assault cannons, which basically is the flyer's anti-horde weaponry. Either of these can be exchanged for an anti-tank variant for no extra points. Both of these loadouts are viable for their intended purposes, but I think that they also show one of the main weaknesses of the Corvus. The damage output can be very swingy. This is due to a combination of low amount of shots on some weapons and rolling dice for number of attacks or even damage on others. In combination with the Corvus not getting the core keyword and therefore lacking sources of hit rerolls, its damage output can pretty much go either way. On the bright side of things, due to 9th edition's Big Guns Never Tire rule, vehicles are at least able to move and fire their heavy weapons without penalty, so that part works in favor of our flyer. There is then the option to take a Hurricane Bolter, which used to be priced at 15 points and now became free, which means this is an auto-include that we will always take. We can then pick between an Auspex array or an Infernum Halo launcher. Taking both at once is not possible, and I would recommend to go with the Auspex array here, which means that the Corvus can ignore the benefits of cover for its attacks. Next, we have the abilities, which are quite numerous. The Corvus does get the Angels of Death ability, meaning it can benefit from Doctrines or Bolter Discipline. Being an aircraft, it is affected by the minimum movement rule described in the core rulebook. I quote, "Aircraft models typically have a move characteristic consisting of 2 values. The first is the model's minimum move characteristic. In its movement phase, all parts of the model space must end the move at least that far from where they started. The second is its maximum move characteristic. No part of the model space can be moved further than this." Basically, in its default flight mode, it will have the minimum movement of 20 inches that have to be done in the way the supersonic ability describes. So basically, you can pivot first, then you have to do the minimum move of 20 inches. The pivot itself does not add to that. In addition to airborne and supersonic, the Corvus also gets hard to hit. However, The Corvus can also be put to hover in the command phase thanks to its hover jets. In that case, it then loses airborne, hard to hit and supersonic, but gains a more regular movement ability up to 20 inches instead. Complicated movement rules aside, it also has a chance to explode when destroyed, and that one can get really nasty as its D6 mortal wounds. Last but not least, it has the Blackstar cluster launcher. After this model has made a normal move or advanced, you can select one enemy unit that this model moved across as part of that move. You then roll 1d6 for each model, up to a maximum of 10d6. On a 6, that enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound. But the Corvus is not just a gun platform, it also has a transport capacity of 12. It can transport both Deathwatch Infantry and Deathwatch Biker models. A Jump Pack or Terminator model takes up 2 spaces, a Centurion or Biker model takes up 3 spaces. Yes, the Corvus can in fact transport Centurions, but personally I would not recommend that, as it's too many eggs in one basket, so to speak. Unfortunately, primaries cannot board the Corvus Blackstar, which is a shame, but well in line with how GW handles most transports. Datasheet aside, GW has been adding a bunch of extra rules for flyers through both the Balanced Status Late as well as the Arks of Omen GT Mission Pack. First of all, there is a limit of 2 aircraft models in a Strike Force-sized game, which is also what the Arks of Omen detachment would allow as a maximum anyway. So we will always be able to fit our flyers into that default detachment for the time being. Now, while this limitation was the result of AdMech and Orcs flyer abuse in the past, I would argue that the average Deathwatch list, or even Space Marines in general, are perfectly fine with being limited to 2 flyers in the first place. There was of course the infamous Nevin Smith running triple Corvus Blackstars at competitive events for a while and doing remarkably decent with them, but I guess that's what we call collateral damage. Anyway, the second and perhaps more relevant change is aircrafts now having to start in strategic reserves, meaning that they can arrive turn 2 the earliest, and for a transport like the Corvus Blackstar, disembark troops on turn 3. Quick note here, as players of older editions might remember this differently, but in 9th edition there are basically 2 main rules for disembarking troops from transports. You can unload troops and then move the vehicle, or aircraft in this case. You can move the vehicle, but then troops cannot get out this turn. What makes this even more counterintuitive is that there are transports like the Impulsor with a special ability called Assault Vehicle that lets them disembark troops after moving, but the Corvus does not have that. Oh, and by the way, unloading troops is not affected by putting it in hover mode or not. So anyway, this puts the relatively fragile Corvus Blackstar in a position where it will likely have to weather a round of fire before deploying its cargo, hence I said don't put the Centurions in there, too juicy of a target. The irony is that GW put us the Shroud Field Stratagem into the supplement, which was pretty costly at 2 CP, but it essentially allows us to protect the Corvus during the first turn. Now with aircrafts having to start in reserves, the Corvus will never be on the battlefield during turn 1 anyway, as such this stratagem has been rendered obsolete. Now, while I am personally not a fan of faction-specific stuff being rendered obsolete without compensation, I also think that GW kind of did us a favor here. Beginning with Warsaw Nephilim, and now continued in Arks of Omen, starting CP got half, and let's be honest here, who would have had 2 spare CP for Shroud Field in the first place? If anything, the 3 strategic reserves now provide the very much needed protection. Doesn't mean that I would not want GW to adjust the stratagem to do something else for the Corvus instead, but at least its loss is not hindering us in any way. On a side note, this leaves the Corvus Blackstar still with the generic Space Marine stratagem Armor of Contempt available to vehicles, which offers some protection against mortal wounds. With the rules out of the way, how can we best make use of the Corvus Blackstar in the Deathwatch? Not going to lie, when I first heard of strategic reserves and turn 3 earliest disembark changes, I was quite discouraged. Personally, I think the Corvus Blackstar is the kind of unit that needs to make use of both its guns as well as its transport capabilities in order to break even. If it does just one, it will easily be outperformed by another more specialized datasheet. I did however come across a strategy discussed on the Deathwatch Discord by DeathwatchSH, inventor of the Deathwatch firewall list for those who remember. It used to be popular prior to the introduction of the Army of Renown. Anyway, full credit to him for this tactical insight. I just wanted to make sure that some Corvus Blackstar love is being spread across the Deathwatch community at large, as I have been quite pleased with my own test results so far. One way to capitalize on these recent changes is to load up half a melee Proteus Kill Team, preferably with a single veteran biker for extra range when disembarking, as well as some servitors. While still in reserves, the Corvus acts as a deep strike threat for your opponent, forcing him to screen as he cannot really ignore both the aircraft plus a punchy half of a Proteus Kill Team. Upon arrival, the Corvus can deliver some hurt with its guns as well as roadblock. While opponents can pass through the base of an aircraft, they cannot end the move there, meaning the Corvus with its large base can be quite annoying when properly positioned. Furthermore, this might open up some capabilities for scoring behind enemy lines secondary, though keep in mind that the Corvus itself cannot score it, but its cargo very much can. Speaking of the wets, should the Corvus Blackstar be shot down before it can disembark them, this is where the servitors come into play. Models can disembark from a destroyed transport, but you must roll a d6 for each model, and then for each roll of 1, a model of your choice is destroyed. This allows us to pick the servitors as casualties, hopefully allowing a good amount of Deathwatch veterans to escape unharmed. Furthermore, there is also the emergency disembark stratagem for 1 CP, giving more room to disembark, but destroying models on a 1 or 2 instead of just a 1. On a final note, the Corvus Blackstar arriving from strategic reserves could also act as an anchor for the Deathwatch teleport homer. Just a friendly reminder here that currently the rules on whether to include this one in a Proteus Kill Team or not are not clear, but if this is something you checked with your event, gaming circle or whatever, this would be a very viable strategy as well. All in all, does this mean that the Corvus Blackstar is finally viable in competitive play? Personally, I think the answer is yes, but by no means an auto-include, and I don't expect it to make the big tournament appearances. As far as I'm concerned, it is going to be far easier to just pick a Redemptor instead, which has greater synergy because of the core keyword, is easier to play and has the potential to stay alive for longer. In comparison, the Corvus Blackstar is one of those Deathwatch tools that has an amazing potential in competent hands, but requires a good amount of skill, practice and luck to successfully pull off. I also think the overall damage is going to end up more swingy, and as previously mentioned, I think the Corvus Blackstar really needs to pull its weight as both a gunship and a transport to make it worth it. On the other hand, there are certainly indirect benefits to forcing your opponent to hold off units back for screening and the sort. Some psychological warfare is not to be underestimated. Half a Proteus Kill Team and cheap servitors also seems to be the sort of points investment that can afford to arrive by turn 3. I think the important takeaway here is not the exact composition of one half of the Proteus Kill Team, but rather taking something roughly around that point's value, allowing the Corvus Blackstar to act as both gunship and transport, plus servitors as a way to mitigate the flyer being potentially shot from the sky before it can regularly disembark its cargo. Having said all that, I am thrilled to bring the best looking flyer back into our lists. Last but not least, here are some modeling recommendations. Well, in fact, I have done an entire video about how to modify the Corvus Blackstar with all sorts of extras, including LEDs, audio and magnets. The link is in the description. Purely from a gameplay point of view, I do recommend magnetizing, which is surprisingly simple. The loadout under the wings is basically just a separate piece of plastic at the very front of the armaments. It can be exchanged easily even without glue, though I recommend socketing a magnet and filling up the empty part inside the wing with some green stuff in order to secure the counterpiece. The weapons mounted under the nose are once again a simple case for magnetizing. As far as all the additional war gear goes, this one doesn't even need magnets as the parts fit on their own. Just don't glue them on the model itself. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the arguably best looking flyer in the entire game, the Corvus Blackstar, uniquely available to the Deathwatch. While the datasheet itself did not change since the release of its 9th edition rules, there has been several points drops as well as free war gear, meaning that we can now get a Corvus Blackstar as cheap as 150 points in total. Quite the bargain. While both anti-horde and anti-tank loadouts are generally viable, especially the latter can be a bit swingy due to the lack of core and having to roll dice for attacks or damage. On the bright side of things, the Hurricane Bolter should now always be taken because it's free, and the same goes for the Auspex Array upgrade, allowing the Corvus to ignore the benefits of cover for its attacks. There is a limit of 2 aircrafts per army, and they now have to start in strategic reserves, both of which turns out to be fine for Deathwatch in general. To get the most out of the Corvus Blackstar, I think the best approach is to have it act as both a gun platform and transport, with the latter being a bit delicate due to the relatively fragile gunship having to wait at least one turn before disembarking. A promising strategy here is to load half a melee Proteus Kill Team as well as some servitors as potential sacrificial lambs in case the flyer is shot down before a regular disembark, which would then allow us to choose the servitors as casualties before the wets. While perhaps not as straightforward and easy to play as a Dreadnought, I now rate the Corvus Blackstar as competitive in Arks of Omen in the hands of someone willing to make the extra effort. Then finally, for modeling recommendations, feel free to check out my dedicated guide to installing all sorts of gimmicks, the link is in the description. So that's it for bringing along the Corvus Blackstar in Arks of Omen. How do you guys rate our beautiful looking flyer with all these latest changes? And are you going to include one in your own lists? Let me know in the comments. Then finally, if you made it this far and I still have your attention, if you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. For that, I have both a Ko-fi as well as a Patreon page, links are in the description. Furthermore, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.